Eros and Civilization, one of Herbert Marcuse's most influential works, and one of the most necessary backdrops of his later social theory. The very nature of this book works from a Marxist and Freudian psychoanalysis perspective. Yet, more than anything, this book works as a sociological endeavor, one where we can find the ontological experience of man in a post-World War II capitalistic society. Right from the start, Marcuse claims that Freud understood the Western subject and their very existence better than just about any prior theorist. Yet, immediately, Marcuse comes out and questions the traditional Freudian outlook that repression is completely necessary to protect us from human destruction, a very destruction that derives itself from our instinctual nature. This leads us right into the title of the book, the first term being Eros. This is one of the two binary instinctual drives that are in internal conflict within the individual. Eros is the care for others. It's love, sexuality, and positive forms of creativity and preservation of humans. This directly coincides with the second drive, Thanatos, also known as the death drive, the drive for chaos, discord, and death. The Eros and Thanatos being in internal conflict with one another. That is the very essence of this book, how our instinctual drives coincide with civilization itself. As this is one of the most important works within the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, it undeniably deserves our attention and gives one of the most elaborate insights over the Western subject and the foundation for Marcuse's later work, One-Dimensional Man. This video is Eros and Civilization, just in video form. So let's get started. Herbert Marcuse starts this book out immediately by claiming that the Neo-Freudians lose the important sociological insights that Freud gave us. That Freud's legacy has been one of individual psychology and psychoanalysis, yet his most important pieces of work actually come from a sociological perspective. Marcuse claims that the Neo-Freudians, the people continuing with Freud's legacy, has turned his work into a rigorous science which constricts itself far too much. A complete abandonment for any sociological analysis, just for individual psychological analysis. Marcuse quotes, "On therapeutic grounds, such a denial may be perfectly justified. However, no therapeutic argument should hamper the development of a theoretical construction which aims not at curing individual sickness, but at diagnosing the general disorder." What Marcuse is ultimately trying to convey is that this individualistic psychological approach should not come at a sacrifice of understanding the actual sociological structures that affects the individual, the political, economic, and social reality that ultimately surrounds us. As we'll see later on, these structures that surround us in society are often the very cause for illness. And these very structures are often ignored in Neo-Freudian schools of thought and modern psychology. Marcuse immediately denies the traditional Freudian approach that the pleasure principle was the constant instinct at the forefront of our very nature. Thus, the Freudian ideal that we must be repressed as human beings through civilization. The pleasure principle is the very instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain to satisfy our biological and psychological needs. We associate this principle with being uncivilized, being a child, someone who just simply seeks pleasure without any concern for their future actions or the present. The opposite principle to this is the reality principle. The reality principle is one of longer-term gratification. Gratification through work, through maybe eating healthier, through the confines and perhaps rules of society. From the typical Freudian perspective, the pleasure principle is something that is the ultimate innate property of our very being. That the reality principle and society at large has to restructure what we view as pleasure, as this very pleasure principle is at the very forefront of our being and thus needs to be quelled. But Marcuse rejects the idea that the reality principle is the ultimate principle that is associated with civilization. There is one more principle, and a much more complex principle at that. That is the nirvana principle. The nirvana principle is the drive for balance, of equilibrium in one's life, an ultimate bridge and connection from the reality principle and the pleasure principle, a symbolic state of the mother's womb, and an ultimate attempt to escape the tension in your life. All these principles derive themselves from your psyche, portions of your psyche at that. The id is the very primitive and instinctual part of your mind. It is ultimately one with the pleasure principle. While the ego is the very realistic part of your mind that mediates the desires themselves from the id, one with the reality principle. And the superego is the very morality that you develop from father figures, systems of authority, symbols, and the like. Understanding these concepts and the relation to modern-day society is incredibly important when looking at Eros and civilization. These concepts are the very core parts of Freudian psychoanalysis, ones that Marcuse ultimately builds off of. These concepts ultimately work as a synthesis for Marxism and psychoanalysis to Marcuse, a synthesis and prospect that many modern psychologists and Neo-Freudians miss today. But Marcuse would even point out that we still don't completely understand the nirvana principle in its whole. The nirvana principle derives itself from the death drive. But how could a principle that seeks balance, equilibrium, ever be derived from the death drive? Marcuse points out that really, the pursuit of the nirvana principle does not come out in a form of peaceful mediation. It ultimately comes out of extremely violent and reactionary politics. It is often a reactionary endeavor where this principle alone is often found to be at the forefront of repressive politics. Maintaining order, the nostalgia of the better days of the past, modern incarnations of the nirvana principle can be seen as forms of fascism. Much of these Marcusean claims completely contradict the pre-existing claims on how these very Freudian principles work themselves out in reality. Another point Marcuse takes aim at is the very reality principle, the principle of suppressing our instincts due to a world that lacks the central resources and ability to achieve our needs. He thinks that this is ultimately a fallacious claim. There is no external lack of resources. Rather, it is the organization of resources that imposes this reality principle, thus necessitating our modern conception of work. We have to work. We have to have a central delay to pleasure, to material, because there is a central lack. We don't have enough resources to go around. While this may be true in the past, in today's world, that is not so. Instead, we have an extreme reorganization of those very resources themselves that still presents itself as a lack to basic working class people, thus still necessitating work in this modern society. It's not the actual limited resources that necessitates this reality principle, it's our reorganization. It's capitalism as we know it. Are you guys picking up on the theme of this book? Psychoanalysis, the structure of our psyche, our being, isn't necessarily imposed by biological origin, by a primal adaptation of an organic primal world that we might initially think. Rather, it is ordered socially, from the confines of civilization itself, and these very societal confines mold our psyche, not the other way around. So if the very reality principle is the foundation of civilization, we can clearly guess that the very ontological experience of man in Western civilization, the very subject that Freud has described, is one of domination, to dominate and to be dominated. It's the ultimate rationalization of domination, the ultimate adherence to the process of labor, and the ultimate external formation of the reality principle. We seek to rise the ranks to assume pleasure and work. This is the very nature of the performance principle that Freud talks about. There is nothing necessarily primal about this whatsoever, rather than society itself tells us that it is, and we act that rationalization out in reality. Marcuse quotes, "For a long way, the interest of domination and the interest of the whole coincide. The profitable utilization of the productive apparatus fills the needs and faculties of the individuals. For the vast majority of the population, the scope and the mode of satisfaction are determined by their own labor. But their labor is work for an apparatus which they do not control, which operates as an independent power to which individuals must submit if they want to live. And in the institution of work, of labor, we see that our subjectivity is repressed into the confines of our workday, basic responsibilities, and the like. The ultimate idea is not to be left alone for too long, not to lose the repressive principles that mold you into an instrument, as too much pleasure, or further, the realization of the possibility of more pleasure, can shake the entire socio-economic foundation." Marcuse would like to make the point that Freud was likely making a descriptive claim of how the world operates and how Eros has changed in a civilized context. Freud quotes, "Daily work of earning a livelihood affords particular satisfaction when it has been selected by free choice." Sound like Western civilization? Of course not. If the typical model for work in the name of Eros, of life-preserving Freudian principles, it can only come from a world where necessities are already met, where we truly do have the liberty of choice at hand. Marcuse argues only then could work serve Eros. Marcuse argues this is the core sociological insights modern scholars either abandon with Freud or fail to see altogether. The prevailing idea that civilization suppresses our innate destructiveness is arguably the opposite. Constant productivity, a destroying of nature, forms of hierarchical behavior and material wealth are the destructive element of the world, and it comes directly from our society as a whole. Mirroring Heidegger's work, The Question Concerning Technology, we see society doesn't only cause destruction, but necessitates it, makes it a more efficient endeavor. With this pre-existing ideal of work, of ultimate repression, as a means of saving us from our inherent nature, civilization must defend itself from a world that truly wants to be free. This gets even deeper. This book continually snowballs itself further and further into a massive indictment of our Western subjectivity and the political and social systems that mold it. The traditional Freudian outlook on the Oedipus complex is not as influential on our primal being as what we'd initially expect. We don't build subjectivity from the tension of fatherly aggression with motherly acceptance in a primitive context. Rather, our subjectivity is given to us from media, from childhood cliques in school. Civilization directly instills this reality principle in us in a far more efficient manner than the traditional parental tension. Our superego, the ideal forms of self, are given to us through institutions, through a medium that is far more complex than a typical male father figure. While being far more complex, these institutions and corporations further offer us this developmental tension by providing a living with access to enough commodities, yet keeping us frugal, at bay with the pleasure principle. But material frugality isn't the largest lack of currency. We ultimately sell the most valuable one, our time. Our time for a society that sells forms of control in the commodity itself. The high standard of living in the domain of the great corporations is restrictive in a concrete sociological sense. The goods and services that the individuals buy control their needs and petrify their faculties. In exchange for the commodities that enrich their life, the individuals sell not only their labor, but also their free time. The better living is offset by the all-pervasive control over living. People dwell in an apartment concentrations and have private automobiles with they can no longer escape into a different world. They have huge refrigerators filled with frozen foods. They have dozens of newspapers and magazines that espouse the same ideals. They have innumerable choices, innumerable gadgets, which are all the same sort, and keep them occupied and divert their attention from the real issue, which is the awareness that they could both work less and determine their own needs and satisfactions. Jesus Christ, what a quote. As we can see, Marcuse ends the first half of the book truly ending our pre-existing notions of Western civilization. And mind you, he wrote this in the 50s when capitalism worked just a little bit better than it does now. Just a little tiny bit. But one of his most damning dismissals is the idea of the Western subject in a larger context. In Marcuse's eyes, modern capitalism is the true collectivist system. We see that people have surface identities, the single mother, broke college student, hardworking laborer, and the like. But these are surface level. We act out our very social reality within the socioeconomic framework in the same light as one another. We buy the same stuff, we're interested in the same stuff, we follow the same orders, and more than anything, you are overly eager to obey and repress yourself. These parameters and how to navigate capitalism are already rigorously structured to the point that true individuality, true individual nature cannot really exist in modern capitalism without serious consequences. And the inevitable question arises, who ultimately cares about any of this? General happiness and comfort have likely increased within the technological continuation of modern capitalism. To this, Herbert Marcuse directly responds that this is likely completely true, yet our content and consciousness has shifted, that our permanent mentality of happiness is permanently augmented. If we are comfortable in capitalism, what have we been conditioned to be comfortable with? 40-plus hour work weeks, just enough pay to partake in the commodity system itself, factory-farmed animal agriculture, and outsourcing of even worse slave labor in other countries? With the hive that capitalism creates, the lack of true individuality that hides behind surface-level hobbies and personality, we see that the content of enjoyment, the parameters of our consciousness, are permanently altered, thus making this very statement is overly positive. Marcuse goes into detail about time reinforcing this reality principle and domination through dialectics of recognition and the Hegelian pursuit of absolute knowledge, of absolute freedom, but more importantly, the Enlightenment individual as a negation. I won't get into huge detail about the Hegelian concepts, but a small explanation of the master-slave dialectic is necessary to understand this. To Hegel, we can't understand who we are without understanding who we are through the lens of someone else. And when two people find themselves, they usually exist within a duality of master and slave, one person occupying the master, the other occupying the slave. As to prove our existence to ourselves, conflict ensues as to impose ourselves on another person, to almost dominate them. Hegel claims this is often a battle to the death, but in the end, we do not choose to kill the other person because we need them in order to recognize ourselves. This is an incredibly simplistic approach to master-slave dialectic. I just wanted to give a quick introduction and overview as for this to make sense. From this perspective, isn't this a negation of the subject? That we can only recognize ourselves through harming or dominating someone else as well. The Hegelian master-slave dialectic reinforces negation of individuals as a mode of domination. It is the subtraction of yourself for the benefit of another, or vice versa. Marcuse claims that even Nietzsche understood this as well, through his very concept of will to power. Nietzsche quotes, "Will, this is the liberator and joy-bringer. Thus I taught you, my friends. But now, this also learn, the will itself is still a prisoner. The will to power, our human drive and life, is also constrained to the very reality principles Marcuse is talking about. Thus, a historical and philosophical recognition of these constraints and confines that affect the Western subject." Marcuse dedicates these central ideas to Chapter 5, that repression isn't necessarily new. It's baked into the very philosophical framework, with philosophers like Hegel and Nietzsche who understood that phenomenon all the way from the philosophical concept of the logos. But not all is lost with Marcuse. Unlike a lot of other contemporary theorists, Marcuse sees potential solutions. He quotes, "Evidently, Freud's theory precludes the construction of any psychoanalytical utopia. If we accept his theory and still maintain that there is historical substance in the idea of a non-repressive civilization, then it must be derivable from Freud's instinct theory itself. In simpler terms, if the reality principle and performance principle are radically exterior and historically elastic, we do have a chance at ending unnecessary repression." Examining the Freudian instinct and how the reality and performance principle constrain our being, there is hope within psychoanalytic parameters that we can change these very constraints away from continued historical surplus repression. This would hopefully strengthen our drives and move our subjectivity towards Eros, the life drive. That is the goal. That is the ultimate solution, to shift our subjectivity and radically reject the notion of unneeded repression. The ideas of a society without unneeded repression have been historically categorized as utopian, and any view that necessitates our current understanding of necessary repression is purely ideological, an essential element of the ideology of the performance principle itself. Marcuse claims that the great refusal, a radical shift in our wants and acceptance, is necessary. We shouldn't just collectively organize, but take more focus on changing our personal subjectivity. Marcuse claims that even within the confines of rationalism, this is the ultimate position. The rejection of surplus repression is the only logical position to hold. Regardless of class, regardless of wealth, these systems of repression, performance, and reality principle deeply hurt us as well. Marcuse elaborates on typical arguments against this. If everyone had their needs taken care of, if everyone had resources carefully divided in a necessary manner, we may not be able to have commodities like TVs, cars. Marcuse claims that this may be the case, but we must understand that all of these desires are created in part from a repressive society. Yet, just as likely, technology could flourish, and the access along with it. Potentials for labor are not as dismal as we would imagine either. Marcuse quotes, "Consequently, the elimination of surplus repression would per se tend to eliminate not labor, but the organization of the human existence into an instrument of labor. If this is true, the emergence of a non-repressive reality principle would alter, rather than destroy, the social organization of labor. The liberation of Eros could create new and durable work relations. This is the fundamental problem with the traditional hypothesis surrounding humans and work. Humans are not inherently lazy, biologically wired to conserve energy. It is the very opposite. Humans are industrious, people who work to improve and harness their surroundings to human benefit. Eros could flourish and create newer forms of non-alienated labor when we focus to remove or remold the current reality principle. In Chapter 8, Marcuse goes into Greek myths surrounding Orpheus, Narcissus, and Prometheus. As I won't go into detail about the myth itself, the myth further instills the idea of a historical reality principle, of deep repression, and in a historical attempt to break through it by way of art and symbols. He claims it tells an archetypal story of how the aesthetic, Orphic, narcissistic Greek images are those of the great refusal, an ultimate victory over Prometheus who embodies the performance and reality principle. As the story goes, these symbols fulfilled us from nature and libidinal forces, from Eros, not from domination. As these archetypes and myths were symbolic, this leads us directly into the aesthetic dimension. Marcuse takes inspiration from Kant's philosophy around aesthetics. To Kant, the aesthetic dimension is the medium in which the senses and the intellect meet. Sensuous as feeling, affection of art, yet also a central universal ideal of what is beauty from an intellectual perspective. Marcuse builds off this with the idea that the aesthetic dimension is the medium in which nature and freedom ultimately meet. Art and beauty is the very object of freedom. When you look at something beautiful, a flower, a painting, you do not immediately think of its tangible usefulness, its ultimate utility. You look at it from the aesthetic perspective, its raw beauty, the fundamental way it makes you feel, and its articulation of the ideal beauty form. From this, art and beauty are truly free. It's severed from the restraints and connections of utility, profit, and the reality principle as a whole. Art harmonizes the feelings and affections with reason. With art, reason and affection do not have to be in conflict. With art, feeling and reason are harmonized, not antagonistic with one another. Reason and affection do not have to be in conflict. There is a reason why we are all collectively devastated when museum pieces are tragically destroyed and when something like the Notre Dame caught fire. Marcuse claims that from this, art is a form of liberation. The further we understand the aesthetic dimension, we can potentially liberate ourselves from a civilization of repression, but not a liberation by means of abolishing civilization and throwing out our current ideas of eros, love, and affection and human connection. We ultimately merge these together as one, as art stands as a central ideal. Art is one of the only truly free things that we have, and thus we should pursue that. Marcuse sees this as our way out. The reactivation of childhood wishes and fantasy is not regression like we'd ultimately think. It's the exact opposite. Our pursuit of beauty, connection, of eros, must be at the ultimate forefront of our being if we want to live in a post-repressive society. Hey guys, thank you so much for making it to the end. As always, I have a huge request. The only way this channel currently stands as is through Patreon. So if you guys are completely able, please consider pledging just a couple dollars a month. It keeps all of this possible. If that is not possible, please consider bookmarking our Amazon link and using the link when purchasing from Amazon. It gives us just a small percentage of what you buy. And more than anything, we can force Jeff Bezos to give us his money. Again, thank you so much and I hope you enjoyed the video.